Hey, and welcome to the 5-Minute Podcast Review for Friday, February 17, 2017. The podcast that introduces you to 5 other podcasts each episode with the philosophy that word of mouth is the way we learn about most new podcasts. So no lengthy reviews, just a quick overview of what each podcast is about. And if any or all of the podcasts catch your interest, you'll find live links right on your screen that'll let you easily download any of the podcasts mentioned. So no need to take notes, just sit back or keep walking or running or whatever you're doing, and just let me tell you about this week's 5 podcasts. So the first podcast is called Bowraville. So Bowraville is a small Australian town in the north coast of New South Wales, and unfortunately it's now best known for the Bowraville murders, where 3 children were killed between 1990 and 91. The 6-part podcast series hosted by crime reporter Dan Box does a deep dive into the Bowraville murders, examining each of the murder investigations, talking to many of the locals, and talking to the key suspect who has been to trial for 2 of the murders and acquitted in each case. Although the Bowraville podcast series finished in May last year, if you haven't listened to it, then right now is a good time to pick it up, because just in the last week there's been an interesting development where police have charged the key suspect for the second time in relation to the murders, a suspect who had previously been acquitted but now can't be named for legal reasons. Charging for the same murder a second time has only been possible due to changes in the New South Wales double jeopardy laws, and it's still not certain that this case can go to trial. But it does add an edge to listening to the series, and particularly the interview with the key suspect. The 6 episodes only run around 30 minutes each, so you can catch up with the whole series in just a few hours of listening. That's Bowraville. Next podcast is How I Built This. In a nutshell, each episode of How I Built This is a pacey 40-minute or so conversation with a fairly well-known, sometimes very well-known entrepreneur about how they built the company they're known for. So at the very well-known end of the scale is a chat with Richard Branson on how he built Virgin. Now, maybe that's a story we all feel like we've heard or read before. So then there's Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger talking about how they built Instagram, or Neil Blumenthal talking about how he built Warby Parker, the online company that changed the way prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses are sold. Or there's Joe Gebbia talking about how he built Airbnb. An episode I found surprisingly interesting was a chat with the 85-year-old Herb Kelleher about how he co-founded and built Challenger airline Southwest, often using Richard Branson-style business and promotional tactics, but decades before any Virgin flight ever left the ground. Anyhow, check out How I Built This. It's worth a listen, and don't skip the episodes with the people or companies you've never heard of, because I've found some of those episodes are the best. On to podcast number 3, Sound Opinions. The co-hosts of Sound Opinions are 2 Chicago newspaper music critics who, for years, were rivals at competing papers. But they teamed up back in 1998 to co-host Sound Opinions, a weekly radio talk show focusing on rock music. And it's been going ever since, with episodes available as podcasts since 2005, as far as I can tell. Sound Opinions is broad-ranging, sometimes focusing on an artist, sometimes focusing on a year of music and review, sometimes focusing on a theme like the Rock Around the Clock episode, which focuses on songs about time, or then there's the recent Valentine's Day episode, which focuses on songs about first impressions and love at first sight. I actually just listened to the February 3rd episode featuring a great discussion with Shelley Collins, and I couldn't believe I'd never heard of her or her music. If you're the same, have a listen. And of course, if you do know who Shelley Collins is, you won't want to miss it. Sound Opinions isn't always on my playlist, but I do keep an eye on it and find plenty of episodes I do want to download. It's definitely one of the best and probably the most popular music podcast out there in the wide podcast ocean. Podcast number 4 is You Made It Weird. This is an interview format podcast that started out with comedian host Pete Holmes, each episode interviewing another usually well-known comedian and asking them about 3 weird things he knew about them. Over time, though, the podcast has evolved into a more general conversationalist podcast. They're always long conversations, often over 2 hours, and very broad-ranging. Sometimes the conversations go on so long that they just become weird. And lately, the interviewees are no longer just limited to comedians, so they could be actors, musicians, even pastors, and sometimes scientists. And occasionally, there are episodes now that are done on stage in front of a live audience. This is probably a podcast mainly for Pete Holmes fans, but if you scroll down the episode list and pick off interviews with people you know, they're usually worth a listen. Interviews with people like Seth Rogen, Judd Apatow, Ben Folds, Tim Minchin, or Gary Shandling, for example. The interviews are long, so you really do get to hear a more in-depth depth and candid view of the person being interviewed. At the end of the day, You Made It Weird is another of the middle-aged white guy talking to another middle-aged white guy type of podcast, but it does stand out from the pack and it does have some genuinely good episodes. So, last podcast this episode is The Bugle. It's a weekly podcast hosted by British comedian Andy Zaltzman and takes a typically British satirical look at the week's news. So Andy typically hosts the show with one of a revolving panel of fellow comedians from around the world, and my favourite co-host is Indian stand-up comedian Anuvab Pal. Here's a short clip of Andy and Anuvab together in last week's episode, breaking down the news of Donald Trump and his bathrobe.
Sean Spicer, his press secretary, found himself denying that Donald Trump owns a bathrobe,
right,
after press allegations that he might wear a bathrobe. I mean, that is an odd thing to deny, particularly from a man whose chain of Trump Hotels, there are 14 hotels listed on the Trump Hotels website. Presumably, he must have stayed in quite a lot. I mean, the chances are he's stolen his own bathrobes off himself. He must have a collection of, I reckon, at least 50 bathrobes that he's nicked out of his own hotel rooms. What a strange thing.
It would be interesting if it was a specific kind of robe, you know? Like if Sean Spicer said, we'd like to clarify, it definitely wasn't a kimono.
Right.
You know, if there was something like that. But it's just, I think the original news story said that most evenings he's alone there because his wife and child are not there in Washington, and he goes up and he just watches TV wearing a bathrobe.
Right.
And I was surprised that that's the part they chose to deny.
Yeah.
Not the fact that he doesn't work past 6 o'clock. You know, so they just focused on the petty detail of,
yeah.
No, he wasn't wearing glasses.
So that's just a small taste of The Bugle. It's a topical podcast, so you really only want to listen to whatever's the latest episode, but it's worth checking out if the idea of something topical, satirical and, well, British sounds appealing. So that's the 5-minute podcast review for this week. Remember, there's live links to all 5 podcasts on your screen, and I'll be back next week with 5 more podcasts. And oh yeah, I meant to say, if you've got any feedback or got a good podcast suggestion, ideally something new or different or obscure or local to your area, email me and let me know. I see we've got listeners all over the world now, including places as diverse as Thailand and the Netherlands. So let me know what podcasts you guys listen to. In fact, wherever you are, let me know. My email address is also on your screen. Look forward to hearing from you. See you next week. Thanks for listening.